Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the stuff out of ACC Media Days, a ton of stuff to break down from there. Obviously, Florida State and Clemson were kind of the main event, but plenty of other stuff to break down from that. But let's jump into segment 3 here. And I cannot get a beat on this season to save my life. There are a number of picks that I'm going to put out throughout next week. I'll break down the schedule at the end of this segment, but overall, I can't get a beat on any of these teams, on any of these conferences, on the title race, on the playoff, everything in between. It feels like it has a million different questions. So I'll get into exactly what I mean here. And I want to start with the playoff because, frankly, I don't know how many teams can actually win the national title. I've gone back and forth on this about a million times throughout the offseason where some days I'll wake up and say, man, there are 13 or 14 teams that absolutely can make some noise in this, and if they catch fire at the right time or they're healthy at the right time, can really go into the playoff and possibly win this thing. And then on the other side of things, I'm thinking there's 16 or 17 games that you have to win now to possibly win a national title, and there's 4 teams in the country, as I see it, that have the depth, that have all of the kind of boxes checked to the degree that you need to make that happen. And it's Ohio State and Oregon, and then it's UGA and Texas. Those are the teams that stand out to me when it comes to don't have to just play their first 22. They can play 44 guys. They can play 66 guys, and it's really, really a remarkable thing that not too many teams across the country have the ability to do this year. Now, there are some teams that are plenty deep and absolutely have the ability to make runs when they need to, but these are the teams that can have some things go wrong and they still are able to make that noise. But on the flip side of that, you absolutely have some teams like Tennessee, like Ole Miss, like Bama even, Penn State, Michigan, that are good enough teams to win a national title. It's just things kind of have to fall into place a little bit better. So when I try to figure out how many teams can actually win a national title, I start with those four. Those four I feel are very, very solid. Ohio State, UGA, Texas, and Oregon absolutely can win a national title. Now, you get into a little bit deeper in the weeds, you can absolutely talk me into Miami. You can talk me into Florida State, Clemson. You can talk me into Kansas State making a crazy run, Utah possibly. You can talk me into a ton of Big Ten teams, including especially the other two other than Ohio State and Oregon that are at the top. So it's impossible to get a beat on what it's going to take to win this national title because it's totally new and how many teams actually have that thing. So right now, I think you could say there's only 4 teams that can actually win a national title, and I probably wouldn't argue with you too much. You could say there's 12 teams that could win a national title, and I probably wouldn't argue with you too much. It's impossible for me to really get a good beat on who actually can win and who's going to come up short and why they're going to come up short has been just incredibly hard to pin down. But on top of this, every single conference has big time questions that I have no idea how the conference is going to go. And we'll start with the Big Ten here. And this one is the most straightforward as I see it. You know, you do have Michigan still there. Penn State has a really good squad. You have USC, Iowa, Nebraska, Wisconsin, and even Washington that could absolutely turn this thing on its head in any weekend throughout the season. But Oregon and Ohio State are standing above these teams. They are just a cut above from a talent level, from quarterback play. I think it's going to be a little bit higher level or a little bit more consistent level at those two at the very least. So I think when I just look at those teams, they stand just a little bit above. And not necessarily to say, Michigan and Penn State or some of these other teams couldn't make that run to Indianapolis, but it really feels like these guys are on a collision course. And it could change throughout the season. Oregon going to Michigan might be the decider there, but overall, it's one of those things that just impossible to get a beat on how many teams are actually going to be a problem in that conference. Right now, I lean that there's only really 2 that have a big time real shot to win this conference, but who knows? It's going to be absolutely crazy to see this one unfold. SEC is a little bit more variable because, frankly, there are about 7 or 8 teams that I could picture winning 10 games. I go through their schedule and I say, yeah, I mean, it totally makes sense for them to only lose 2 of these on the schedule and keep it moving into the playoff, but not everyone can do that. Whether it's LSU, Ole Miss, Tennessee, Missouri, Bama, Texas, UGA, someone's going to have a disappointing season. Someone's going to miss out on the playoff. In fact, probably multiple of these teams are going to miss out on the playoff. I would argue of those seven I just named, at least three are not making the playoff field, and I don't know who those are going to be. I could poke holes in LSU pretty easily with that back end defense. I think Missouri, you could very easily tell me, is going to take a big step back this year. Bama has problems on the defensive back end, and really in the defense as a whole, I'm a little bit nervous about how good they're going to be on that side of the ball. Tennessee, you never really know what you're getting from Nico Iamaleava, although I think he's absolutely incredible. I think he's going to be really awesome. You don't know until he gets on the field. And then Ole Miss is one of those teams that everyone seems to know exactly what's going to happen, but when you add that many transfers to the defensive side of the ball with a guy like Pete Golding, who I don't necessarily love too much, I don't necessarily think it's as cut and dry as some people think. And then you have A&M and OU just kind of lurking in the background that absolutely could throw a wrench into the entire thing. So the SEC is definitely a little bit more variable. The ACC is the one that is almost impossible to get a beat on because I can't get a beat on the top three teams in this conference. I think Clemson is going to play really good defense. I think Florida State is going to play really good defense. I think Miami is going to be dangerous in a number of different ways, and Cam Ward's going to have a good season. I don't know what all that means when it comes to the ACC title race. I don't know, what is Clemson going to do on the offensive side of the ball? How does Cade Klubnik look in that offense, and how comfortable does he look? Florida State, can DJU make the plays that need to be made down the stretch to win a title? Miami, adding a lot of transfers is always something that you're walking a bit of a tightrope, and if you can find a way to make it all work, then you're going to be a really talented team and a really good team, but there's always the flip side of that where it just doesn't come together the way you want, and it kind of leads to a disappointing season. And then you have teams lurking in the background that have plenty to say about this conference. Virginia Tech, NC State, Louisville, SMU, all are teams that absolutely can make some noise and totally change this conference on a Saturday. So it's going to be wild, this one, but the number one wild conference is the Big 12. It's the one that every single week you will look up and see a one-score, last-second type game in the Big 12 because there's no team that is leaps and bounds ahead of others. There's about 10 teams in this conference that I could realistically paint a path to them getting to the title game. Now, some were a little bit longer than others. I think Colorado is a team that does have a relatively long shot to make the title game and to win this conference, but they absolutely can do it. If Shedeur Sanders is upright from the majority of this season, they're as dangerous as pretty much any team in this conference. Utah and KSU are the teams that I tend to believe are a cut above. You can add Oklahoma State into that conversation if you'd like, but I tend to believe KSU and Utah are just the tier 1 teams here, but then Oklahoma State, Kansas, Arizona, UCF are not far behind them by any means. So that conference is going to be just about impossible to pin down. So long story short, I've switched every single pick for every single conference about 5 different times before I've started really putting, as I've started kind of putting together what I think is going to happen. So I'll have the Big Ten ready on Monday, and I will feel as confident as I possibly can, but I can't promise it's going to be super confident, I'll be honest. But then you have the Heisman Trophy that I think is going to be off the charts incredible this year. There's so many guys that absolutely can make a run at this, and tons of really explosive, fun offenses out there. And then you have Clemson, you have Utah that absolutely can make some noise, and maybe Cam Rising or Cade Klubnik or someone that make their way into this conversation. And you have someone like Carson Beck leading the way there. He is someone that, as of right now, I'm leaning that direction. Obviously, that could change before Friday when I make that pick, but overall, this is a really, really talented guy and definitely someone that, if you want to make the safe pick for Heisman, I don't think you can necessarily go wrong with Carson Beck. But on the other side of that, you have a ton of other awards that are going to be just impossible to pin down. You have a ton of running backs and wide receivers that are working for the Heisman or the Biletnikoff or the Doak Walker. Those are going to be incredible battles top to bottom. But then the defensive awards are going to be absolutely crazy. On the interior defensive line, you have incredible duos in Ann Arbor and in South Bend that absolutely will make some noise in that conversation. And then you have James Pierce Jr., you have Michael Williams, Reuben Bain, Caleb Downs, Malachi Starks, all guys that absolutely can win a Nagurski Trophy and be the best player on the defensive side of the ball this year. So it's just going to be incredible. Add into all of that we have a playoff coming up that no one really knows how it's going to go. No one knows how the last couple of weeks of the season are going to go. Are people going to get rested because you're already in the conference title? Are there going to be upsets at the end of the season that totally switch things up? Is there going to be a 9-3 team that makes their conference title and then wins it and gets into the playoff? And how does that work for the other team on the other side? But that was 11-1 walking into that game. There are a million different variables that are going to come into play throughout the season, and it's one of those seasons that you can do your best to kind of pinpoint what's going to happen throughout the season. You can do your best to figure out, this is the way the Big Ten's going to go. This is the way the SEC is going to go. This is the way the ACC is going to go, and the Big 12 and the playoff. But I don't think anyone has an idea. I think everyone's just kind of throwing darts at the wall, and frankly, that's probably what I'll be doing next week. But overall, I think it's going to be a really, really fun exercise. Let's get into the schedule here, and we'll start with the Big Ten on Monday. We'll get into all of the stuff that you need to know. I'll give quick thoughts on every team, obviously some quicker than others, respectfully. Then we'll get into a record pick for all, kind of a fool's errand, but I'll give it to you guys none the same. Championship matchup and winner, definitely, absolutely, we'll give that. And then I'll give the offensive player of the year, defensive player of the year, newcomer, so transfer or freshman, either or, don't necessarily care one way or the other. Maybe I'll give a freshman and a transfer one, who knows, but and then I'll give the coach of the year. So that's what you'll get from every conference. You'll get the Big Ten, which has a dash instead of a colon, which is weird, but Tuesday you'll get the SEC, Wednesday ACC, and Thursday Big 12. I just broke it down on how hard it's going to be to pick these conferences, frankly. And then you'll get the playoff and the postseason awards, the Heisman, the Blitnikoff, all of those, maybe even an All-American team in there on Friday. So it's about time to get this thing started. We're under a month from this thing really getting underway, at least week 0, which is what I count down to, but that's to each their own on that one. I think this season is going to be off the walls incredible. I was walking into last season, and I was about as excited as I've ever been for a college football season. There was so much going into that year, and I absolutely loved that it was kind of the end of an era, and there was so much to get into, but this one absolutely dwarfs the excitement that I had a year ago, because the amount of things that can happen is just going to be off the wall. So your guess is as best as mine. I will give my best guess on next week's shows, but overall, just cannot wait for this season and the chaos to start. But let's take our third break here. When we come back, we're going to talk about the biggest 4-game stretches for some big-time title contenders. This will likely be our last one around. We've done 12 teams, or we will have done 12 teams at the end of this, and definitely feel like that's likely where I draw the line at the very most. But we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.